The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Marcus Chen pushed his cart down the marble hallway of Meridian Tower, the 60-story monument to corporate ambition that had become his second home. It was 11:47 p.m., and the building breathed differently at this hour, softer, more honest somehow. The executive offices lay in darkness, their occupants long gone. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus paused outside the corner office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city's glittering sprawl. Through the glass partition, he could see her, a small figure hunched over an enormous mahogany desk surrounded by towers of paper that seemed to dwarf her 8-year-old frame. Lily Hartwell, daughter of CEO Jonathan Hartwell, sat with the rigid posture of someone far older than her years, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face as she worked. The sight never failed to tug at something deep in Marcus's chest. He had been cleaning these floors for 3 years now, working nights to support his daughter Emma. In all that time, he had never once seen Lily smile, not when her father brought her elaborate toys from business trips to Tokyo, not when the other executives' children visited during company picnics, not even on her birthday, when a cake the size of a small table had been wheeled into the office and she had blown out the candles with the mechanical precision of someone fulfilling an obligation. Tonight, she was folding again. Her fingers moved with the fluid grace of a master craftsman, transforming ordinary printer paper into intricate birds, flowers, and geometric shapes that seemed to breathe with their own life. The desk was covered with her creations, a menagerie of paper animals that watched over her with careful eyes, a garden of origami flowers that would never wilt, and in the center of it all, a single unfinished crane. Marcus had learned this art from his grandmother, who taught him that cranes carried wishes for those pure of heart. 1,000 cranes, she had told him in Vietnamese accented English, and the gods will grant you one miracle. He knocked softly on the door frame, the sound barely audible over the building's nighttime symphony of humming electronics and distant traffic. Lily's head snapped up, her dark eyes wide with the startled alertness of someone accustomed to being alone. "Sorry to disturb you, Miss Lily," Marcus said, keeping his voice gentle. He had learned that sudden movements and loud voices made her retreat further into herself. She nodded once, a sharp, economical gesture, and returned to her folding. But Marcus caught the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, the subtle shift that told him she didn't mind his presence. Over the months, they had developed an unspoken understanding. He would go about his cleaning duties, and she would continue her paper crafts, two solitary figures finding comfort in shared silence. As Marcus moved around the office, collecting discarded papers and wiping down surfaces, he found himself stealing glances at her work. Tonight's creation was different from her usual repertoire. The crane she was attempting seemed to be giving her trouble. Her normally precise folds were hesitant, uncertain. She would get partway through the complex sequence, then unfold the paper and start again, her small face creased with concentration and something that looked dangerously close to frustration. "Having trouble with that one?" Marcus asked softly, pausing near her desk. He immediately regretted the words. Lily rarely spoke to anyone except her father, and even those conversations were brief, businesslike exchanges that belonged in a boardroom rather than between parent and child. But instead of retreating into silence, Lily looked up at him with those serious dark eyes. "The wings won't lie flat," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and the neck keeps collapsing." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he hadn't realized was closed. "May I?" He gestured toward the half-formed crane in her hands. She hesitated for a long moment, then carefully placed the paper on the desk between them. Marcus pulled a clean sheet from his card, Good quality printer paper, bright white and crisp. He sat down in the chair across from her, his janitor's uniform incongruous against the expensive leather. "My grandmother taught me this when I was about your age," he said, beginning with the basic preliminary fold. "She said every crane carries a piece of the folder's soul. That's why they have to be made with patience and care." Lily watched his hands with the intensity of a surgeon observing a particularly delicate procedure. Marcus moved slowly, deliberately, narrating each step in the same gentle voice his grandmother had used all those years ago. "You start with the bird base. See how the paper wants to fold here? Don't force it. Let it show you the way." He demonstrated the inside reverse fold that would form the crane's neck, his fingers remembering the motion even after decades. "The secret is in the breath. You breathe life into the paper, and the paper remembers." When he finished, a perfect crane sat on the desk between them, its wings spread as if ready for flight. For the first time since he had known her, Marcus saw something flicker across Lily's face. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes that suggested wonder. "Your turn," he said, sliding another sheet of paper across the mahogany surface. What happened next would replay in Marcus's memory for years to come. Lily picked up the paper, and instead of the mechanical precision he was accustomed to seeing, her movements became fluid, almost musical. She followed his guidance with the instinctive grace of someone who had been waiting her whole life to learn this particular dance. Her small fingers moved with growing confidence, and when she reached the final steps, the gentle pull that opened the wings, the careful shaping of the head, something magical occurred. The crane that emerged from her hands was not just technically perfect, it was alive with something Marcus couldn't name, something that made his breath catch in his throat. And as she held it up to the light, examining her creation with the pride of an artist who has discovered her true medium, Lily Hartwell smiled. It was barely there, a ghost of an expression that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it transformed her entire face. For that brief moment, she looked like what she was, a child who had just discovered joy. The moment was shattered by the soft chime of the elevator, followed by the sharp click of expensive shoes on marble. Jonathan Hartwell's voice carried down the hallway, pitched low but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I don't care what time it is in Tokyo, the Nakamura deal needs to be finalized before the market opens." Marcus was on his feet instantly, his training as a janitor kicking in. Late-night cleaning staff were meant to be invisible, ghosts who moved through the corporate world without leaving traces. But as he gathered his supplies, he caught sight of Lily carefully placing the crane in her desk drawer, her face once again assuming the careful mask of composure that seemed to be her default expression. "Daddy's back," she whispered, and there was something in those 2 words that made Marcus's heart clench. Jonathan Hartwell entered the room like a force of nature, his presence filling the room with the kinetic energy of someone who moved through life at double speed. He was younger than Marcus had expected when he first saw him, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of sharp-featured handsomeness that looked good on magazine covers and business television. But there was something brittle about him, something that suggested a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. "Lily, sweetheart, you should be in bed," he said, his voice softening as he approached his daughter. But even his tenderness carried the efficiency of someone checking an item off a to-do list. "Mrs. Patterson is waiting for you in the car." "I was just finishing," Lily began, but her father was already moving, closing her laptop, gathering the scattered papers on her desk. "You can work on your projects tomorrow," he said, pausing slightly before the word projects, as if he couldn't quite understand why anyone would choose to spend time folding paper. His eyes briefly registered Marcus's presence with the kind of polite acknowledgement reserved for service personnel, then returned to his daughter. As father and daughter prepared to leave, Marcus found himself gripping the handle of his cleaning cart tighter than necessary. There was something wrong with this picture. A child spending her evenings in a corporate office folding paper birds in solitude while her father conducted international business deals. But who was he to question the domestic arrangements of the city's most powerful CEO? He was just the janitor, invisible and temporary, a ghost who cleaned up after other people's lives. But as they headed toward the elevator, Lily glanced back over her shoulder. Her eyes met Marcus's for just a moment, and in that brief connection, he saw something that would haunt him for weeks to come. It wasn't sadness, exactly, or loneliness, though both were there. It was recognition, the look of one isolated soul acknowledging another. The elevator doors closed with a whisper, and Marcus was alone again with the hum of fluorescent lights and the weight of unanswered questions. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty office, trying to process what had just occurred. In his 3 years of night shifts, he had never exchanged more than a few words with any of the building's daytime occupants. But somehow, in the space of 20 minutes, a small girl's tentative smile had cracked something open inside him. He finished his rounds mechanically, his mind replaying the moment when Lily's fingers had shaped that final crane. There had been something almost spiritual about it, the way the paper had seemed to respond to her touch, the way her entire body had relaxed into the familiar rhythms of creation. It reminded him of watching Emma at her easel, the way his own daughter disappeared into her paintings with complete absorption, emerging hours later with paint-stained fingers and eyes bright with accomplishment. The comparison stopped him cold. Emma, his 10-year-old daughter who lived with her mother across town, whom he saw every other weekend and Wednesday evenings, whose artwork covered the walls of his small apartment like declarations of love. Emma, who had inherited his mother's artistic soul and her grandmother's stubborn determination to see beauty in everything. When had he started thinking of his cleaning job as just that, a job? When had he stopped seeing the people who worked in these offices as fully realized human beings with complex inner lives? The realization was uncomfortable, like discovering he had been sleepwalking through his own life. As he wheeled his cart toward the freight elevator, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow night, he would bring more paper, good paper, not the cheap copy paper that filled the office supply closets, but real origami paper, the kind his grandmother had special ordered from shops in Japantown. If Lily was going to fold cranes, she deserved materials worthy of her obvious talent. The elevator descended through the building's various floors, accounting, marketing, human resources, each level a world unto itself, populated during the day by people with their own stories, their own struggles, their own small moments of joy and disappointment. Marcus had cleaned around their desks for years without really seeing them as anything more than obstacles to navigate or surfaces to dust. But Lily's smile had changed something in him. The basement parking garage was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to the building's overnight security staff and the handful of other maintenance workers who kept the corporate machine running while the city slept. Marcus's beat-up Honda Civic looked shabby next to the sleek German sedans and Italian sports cars, but it started on the first try and had never left him stranded, which was more than he could say for some relationships. As he drove through the empty streets toward his apartment in the Mission District, Marcus found himself thinking about patterns, not the kind that governed stock markets and quarterly reports, but the deeper rhythms that connected all living things, the way a child's laugh echoed through a canyon of glass and steel, the way a perfect fold could transform a flat piece of paper into something that seemed ready to take flight, the way a single moment of recognition between strangers could plant seeds that might grow into something beautiful. His apartment was a study in efficient use of space. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely large enough for one person to move around in comfortably. But the walls were covered with Emma's artwork, splashes of color that transformed the small space into something warm and alive. Tonight, as he heated up leftover Chinese takeout, Marcus studied those paintings with fresh eyes. Here was a purple elephant dancing under a rainbow. There, a family of bears having a picnic on the moon. Each image was a window into his daughter's imagination, a reminder that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than the fluorescent-lit corridors of Meridian Tower suggested. He pulled out his phone and almost called Emma before remembering that it was nearly 1 in the morning. Instead, he sent a text to his ex-wife Sarah. "Tell Emma I'm thinking about her. Give her a hug from Dad." The response came surprisingly quickly. "She's asleep, but I will. Everything okay? You don't usually text this late." Marcus stared at the screen, trying to figure out how to explain the evening's events without sounding like he was having some kind of midlife crisis. "Just had an interesting night at work. Got to teach someone how to make a paper crane." "That's sweet. Emma would love that. You should teach her next weekend." The idea hit him like a revelation. Of course! Emma would love origami. Why had he never thought to share his grandmother's art with his own daughter? Perhaps because it was tangled up with too many complicated emotions, memories of childhood, of loss, of the dreams he had abandoned when reality demanded more practical choices. But as he finally fell asleep that night, Marcus was already planning. He would teach Emma to fold cranes, and tomorrow night he would bring proper paper to the office. 2 small acts of creation in a world that sometimes seemed determined to tear everything down. He didn't yet know that these simple decisions would set in motion a series of events that would transform not just his life and Lily's, but the entire culture of Meridian Tower. He didn't know about the newspaper article that would eventually be written, or the documentary that would follow, or the foundation that would be established in his grandmother's name. All he knew was that a small girl had smiled when she held a paper crane, and that smile had reminded him of something essential he had forgotten. As sleep finally claimed him, Marcus dreamed of paper birds filling the sky above the city, their wings catching the light of dawn as they carried messages of hope to everyone below. Marcus Chen's alarm clock had been broken for 6 months, but he no longer needed it. His body had internalized the rhythms of his dual existence. Up at 6:30 a.m. to get Emma ready for school on the days she stayed with him, then a few hours of restless sleep before his 10 p.m. shift at Meridian Tower. On the days she lived with Sarah, he worked odd jobs during the daylight hours. Handyman work for elderly neighbors, weekend shifts at his friend Rico's landscaping business, anything that paid cash and didn't require him to explain the gap in his resume where failed entrepreneur should have been written. This particular Thursday morning found him in the kitchen of Mrs. Chen's apartment. No relation, despite the shared surname, just another coincidence in a life that seemed full of them. Mrs. Chen was 83, sharp as a tack, and had been feeding the neighborhood strays for decades, both human and feline. She paid him $20 to fix her leaky faucet, then insisted he stay for tea and mooncakes while she told him stories about her late husband's grocery store, the one that had been bulldozed to make room for a Starbucks 15 years ago. "You remind me of David," she said, pouring jasmine tea from a pot that had traveled with her from Hong Kong 40 years earlier. He had that same look in his eyes, like he was carrying something heavy but didn't want to burden anyone else with it. Marcus accepted the tea gratefully, inhaling the delicate floral scent that always reminded him of his grandmother's apartment. "What kind of look is that, Mrs. Chen?" "The look of a man who's forgotten who he used to be." She studied him with the penetrating gaze of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the universal patterns of human struggle. "David wanted to be a poet, you know. Even after we opened the store, he would write verses on receipt paper during slow afternoons, little observations about the customers, the way light fell through the front window, the conversations he overheard while people waited in line." She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a shoebox filled with scraps of paper covered in Chinese characters. "After he died, I found these tucked away in his sock drawer. Hundreds of them. A whole secret life of beauty that he never shared with anyone." Marcus held one of the papers, unable to read the elegant characters but moved by the careful handwriting, the obvious care with which each word had been formed. Why didn't he ever publish them? Same reason you stopped making those beautiful wood sculptures Sarah told me about. Same reason your grandmother's origami lessons became just a memory instead of a living practice. Mrs. Chen's voice was gentle but insistent. Life convinces us that practical things are the only things that matter. We forget that the soul needs beauty like the body needs food. The conversation haunted Marcus as he drove across town to pick up Emma from school. He had been avoiding Sarah's neighborhood lately. Too many memories embedded in the familiar streets, too many ghosts of the man he used to be. But Emma was worth navigating any amount of emotional turbulence. She bounded out of Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary like a small explosion of energy, her backpack bouncing, her dark hair escaping from its ponytail in the way that always made his heart clench with recognition. She had inherited his eyes, but Sarah's smile, and when she grinned at him through the car window, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of joy and loss that defined his relationship with parenthood. "Dad, guess what happened in art class today?" She scrambled into the passenger seat, her words tumbling over each other with the breathless excitement that was her natural state. "Mrs. Rodriguez showed us this video about a guy in Japan who makes these tiny sculptures out of paper, and they're so small you need a magnifying glass to see them, but they're perfect, like miniature worlds. And she said some people spend their whole lives learning to make just one perfect thing. And isn't that amazing?" Marcus felt something shift in his chest, the same sensation he had experienced the night before when Lily smiled. "That does sound amazing. What else did you learn?" "Well," she said, "art isn't just about making pretty things to hang on walls. She said art is about paying attention, really, really close attention to things that other people might think are ordinary or boring. Like, she showed us this painting of just a bowl of fruit, but the way the artist painted it made you see how beautiful a regular old apple could be if you really looked at it." As they drove to his apartment, Emma chattered about her day, but Marcus found himself listening with new intensity to the passion in her voice, the natural curiosity that made her see wonder in everything. When did he stop looking at the world through those eyes? When had paying close attention stopped being a priority? His apartment felt different that evening as they prepared dinner together. Mac and cheese from a box, but elevated by Emma's running commentary about the optimal cheese-to-pasta ratio and her elaborate plans for a restaurant where every dish would be a different color of the rainbow. As she talked, Marcus found himself studying her hands, the way they moved with unconscious grace as she stirred the pasta, the same fluid precision he had seen in Lily's origami work. "Emma," he said carefully, "would you like to learn how to fold paper cranes?" She stopped stirring and looked at him with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for National Geographic documentaries about marine biology. "Like origami? The Japanese art? Yes, absolutely yes. Can we start right now? Do you know how to do it? Where did you learn?" The questions tumbled out of her in a rush, and Marcus realized he was smiling, really smiling for the first time in weeks. "My grandmother taught me when I was about your age. She used to say that every crane carries a wish." "What kind of wish?" Emma's eyes were wide with possibilities.
Any kind. But the wish only comes true if you fold the crane with your whole heart. No distractions, no rushing. You have to be completely present for each fold. They spent the evening at his small kitchen table, surrounded by pieces of notebook paper that Emma had decorated with colored pencils. Not traditional origami paper, but infused with her own artistic vision. Marcus guided her through the basic folds, his hands moving with muscle memory, while his voice carried echoes of his grandmother's patient instruction. Emma's first attempts were clumsy, her fingers not yet trained to the precise movements required. But she approached each failure with the resilience that children possess in abundance, unfolding and refolding with determination that reminded Marcus of why he had fallen in love with Sarah in the first place, her refusal to give up on anything she cared about.
"Dad?"
Emma said as she worked on her fourth attempt, "Why did you stop doing art?" The question caught him off guard. He had thought he was being subtle about his own abandoned dreams, but children were natural archaeologists, excavating truth from the smallest behavioral clues. "I didn't stop, exactly. I just put it aside for a while. Adult responsibilities, you know?" But Mrs. Rodriguez says that artists never really stop being artists. She says it's like being left-handed or having brown eyes. It's just part of who you are, even if you're not using it. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a door he had kept locked for years. What else does Mrs. Rodriguez say? She says that every person has at least one thing they're meant to create, something that only they can make in exactly that way. And when they don't create it, the world is a little less complete. Emma paused in her folding, looking up at him with the devastating honesty that children wielded without realizing its power. "What were you meant to create, Dad?" The question followed him through the rest of Emma's visit and into his shift at Meridian Tower. As he moved through the familiar routine of emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces, Marcus found himself seeing the building differently, not just as a monument to corporate achievement, but as a space where hundreds of people spent the majority of their waking hours, where dreams came to thrive or die, where small human moments played out against the backdrop of quarterly reports and strategic initiatives. He had been carrying a small stack of origami paper in his cart for 2 days now, waiting for the right moment to approach Lily again. Tonight, as he made his way to the 40th floor, he felt like a missionary carrying precious relics to a foreign land. But when he reached Jonathan Hartwell's office, it was empty. The desk was cleared except for a single manila folder and a coffee cup bearing the residue of what must have been a very long day. The chair where Lily usually sat was pushed back from the desk, as if she had left quickly. Marcus found himself studying the space with new eyes, looking for clues about the lives lived within its walls. The office was expensively furnished but impersonal, the kind of space designed to impress rather than comfort. The only personal touches were a few framed photographs on Hartwell's desk, a formal wedding portrait from what must have been 15 years ago, showing a younger Jonathan and a woman with kind eyes and Lily's delicate features. A more recent photo of Lily at what looked like a school awards ceremony, her face serious as if she held a certificate for academic excellence. There were no children's drawings on the walls, no handmade gifts tucked between the law books, none of the gentle chaos that Emma brought to every space she inhabited. Marcus realized that in all his months of observing Lily, he had never seen her behave like a child. No giggling, no fidgeting, no spontaneous outbursts of joy or frustration. She moved through the adult world with the careful composure of someone who had learned early that childish behavior was unwelcome. The revelation made him feel physically ill. How many evenings had she spent in this sterile environment, surrounded by the tools of her father's ambition, but lacking the simple materials of childhood creativity? How many times had she created her intricate origami menagerie while yearning for someone to notice, to appreciate, to share in the wonder of transformation? Marcus left a small stack of origami paper in the center of her usual workspace, held down by a simple note. For someone who understands that beauty can be folded into existence. M. The next evening, the paper was gone, and in its place sat a small origami garden, 5 perfect roses in varying shades of red and pink.
Their petals so delicately crafted they seemed to tremble in the air conditioning's gentle breeze. Beside them was a note in careful handwriting. "Thank you. They told me about colors I had forgotten existed." Marcus stared at the roses for a long moment, understanding that he was looking at more than skillful paper folding. These were prayers made manifest, wishes given form, the artistic expression of a child who had been carrying too much beauty inside with nowhere to let it out. Over the following weeks, they established a rhythm. Marcus would leave new paper and occasionally a simple tool, a bone folder he had borrowed from his sculptor days, or a small ruler for measuring precise angles. Lily would respond with increasingly ambitious creations, a dragon whose scales caught the light from multiple angles, a lotus flower that opened when touched, a flock of tiny birds that seemed poised for flight. But it was the note she left after his third offering that stopped Marcus in his tracks. "My mother used to fold paper butterflies. She said they carried messages between this world and the next. I wonder if the cranes carry messages too." The past tense hit him like a physical blow. He had assumed that Lily's mother was simply absent, perhaps traveling, perhaps working late hours like her father. But there was something in the careful way Lily had written "used to" that suggested a more permanent absence. Marcus found himself thinking about Emma's easy chatter about her day, her assumption that both her parents would always be available to hear about her triumphs and disasters. He thought about the casual way she mentioned "when I grow up" and "when I have kids," her future stretching ahead of her like an infinite canvas waiting to be painted. Lily, by contrast, seemed to exist in a careful present tense, as if planning too far ahead was a luxury she couldn't afford. The thought kept him awake during his few hours of sleep and followed him through his daytime odd jobs. He found himself looking at every parent-child interaction with new intensity, cataloging the small gestures of affection that he had previously taken for granted. A father patiently tying a shoelace, a mother listening with genuine interest to a rambling story about playground politics, the casual "I love you" exchanged at drop-off and pickup. When had Jonathan Hartwell last told his daughter he loved her? When had he last asked about her dreams, her fears, her opinions about anything more significant than where she wanted to have dinner? When had he really looked at her, not as an extension of his own carefully managed life, but as a separate person with her own complex inner world? The thoughts made him uncomfortable because they forced him to examine his own parenting. How many of Emma's art projects had he praised with distracted enthusiasm while checking his phone? How many times had he given her efficient hugs instead of the long, lingering embraces she craved? How often did he really listen to her stories instead of waiting for his turn to offer advice or redirect the conversation toward practical matters? The realization that he might have more in common with Jonathan Hartwell than he cared to admit was deeply unsettling. Both men working multiple jobs to provide for their daughters, both struggling to balance financial necessities with emotional availability, both carrying the weight of dreams deferred in the name of responsibility. But there was a crucial difference Marcus realized. Emma still lived in a world where her voice mattered, where her creativity was celebrated, where she could expect to be heard and valued and loved unconditionally. Lily seemed to be growing up in an environment where her worth was measured by her ability to cause no inconvenience, to exist gracefully on the margins of her father's more important concerns. The thought made him want to gather every piece of origami paper in the city and deliver it to her personally, to sit with her in that sterile office and fold an entire universe of paper creatures that would remind her that the world contained infinite possibilities for beauty and connection. Instead, he did what he could within the boundaries of his role as night janitor. He continued leaving paper and small encouraging notes. He began timing his arrival at his father's office to coincide with her presence, offering gentle guidance on advanced folding techniques when she seemed frustrated with a particular project.
And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lily began to change. Not dramatically, she was still the same serious, composed child, but Marcus began to catch glimpses of the person she might become if given room to grow. A soft laugh when one of her cranes came out slightly lopsided, a question about his own origami experience, a shy smile when he complimented a particularly innovative fold she had discovered. But it was the evening when he found her crying that everything shifted into focus. She was hunched over her desk, shoulders shaking with the effort of silent tears, a half-finished crane crumpled in her small fist. "Hey," Marcus said softly, abandoning all pretense of professional distance. "What's wrong?" Lily looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "I can't remember her hands," she whispered. "I try to fold the way she showed me, but I can't remember how her hands moved. And if I can't remember that, then I'm forgetting her." Marcus felt his heart break open. Without thinking, he moved around the desk and knelt beside her chair, the same way he would with Emma, when nightmares made the darkness too scary to face alone. "Tell me about her," he said simply. And for the first time since he had known her, Lily began to talk. The story that spilled out of Lily Hartwell that night painted a picture that would haunt Marcus for months to come. Her mother, Catherine, had been a graphic designer with her own small studio, someone who saw the world through an artist's eyes and had tried to pass that vision on to her daughter. The origami lessons had started when Lily was 5, during Catherine's chemotherapy treatments, a way to keep small hands busy during long hospital visits while creating something beautiful from the sterile medical environment. She said that every time we folded something together, we were having a conversation that didn't need words, Lily whispered, her voice barely audible over the building's nighttime hum. And when she got too tired to talk, we would just sit and fold, and I could feel what she was thinking through her fingers. Catherine had died 18 months ago, a fact that Marcus absorbed like a physical blow. In that time, Lily had been shuttled between nannies and after-school programs, spending her evenings in her father's office because Jonathan Hartwell couldn't bear to hire another caregiver who might leave, couldn't risk another attachment that might prove temporary. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to see the invisible architecture of Lily's carefully constructed world. Her father loved her, that much was clear, but his love was filtered through layers of grief and professional obligation that kept it from reaching her in the way she needed most. Jonathan provided everything a modern parent was supposed to: excellent schools, educational enrichment, material comfort. But he had no idea how to provide the emotional sustenance that would allow her daughter's spirit to flourish. Celebration. A champagne bottle stood open on the conference table, surrounded by contracts and legal documents, and Jonathan was on the phone with someone in London, his voice animated with success. "The Nakamura deal is finalized," he was saying, pacing behind his desk with the restless energy of someone who had just secured a victory that had been months in the making. $200 million in new contracts, exclusive distribution rights for the Asian markets. This changes everything. Lily sat at her usual spot, but instead of folding papers, she was working on what appeared to be a school project, a poster board covered with carefully arranged photographs and handwritten text. Marcus could see the title from across the room, My Family History. As Jonathan concluded his phone call, Lily looked up with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Daddy, I finished my project. Mrs. Kim says we're supposed to present them tomorrow, and I wanted to show you first." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Jonathan said, but his attention was already shifting to another stack of documents. "I'm sure it's excellent. Why don't you put it in your bag so you don't forget it tomorrow?" "But don't you want to see it?" There was something fragile in Lily's voice, a note that made Marcus pause in his cleaning to watch the interaction more carefully.
Of course I do, but right now Daddy has to review these contracts. The lawyers are waiting for my signature. Jonathan glanced up briefly, offering the kind of distracted smile that parents perfect when they're trying to multitask affection with more pressing concerns. But Lily had spent 18 months learning to read the subtle signals of dismissal. Marcus watched her carefully place the poster board back in her school bag, her movements precise and controlled. There was no tantrum, no dramatic protest, just the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned not to expect too much. Maybe this weekend, Jonathan added, already reaching for his pen. We'll have more time then. Marcus knew, as Lily probably did, that this weekend would bring its own emergencies, its own urgent demands. There would always be one more contract to review, one more crisis to manage, one more reason why a little girl's school project would have to wait. What happened next unfolded with the horrible inevitability of a car accident. As Jonathan leaned over his desk to sign the contracts, his elbow knocked against his coffee cup, sending a cascade of dark liquid across the mahogany surface. Papers scattered, documents that represented months of negotiations suddenly threatened by spreading stains. "Damn it!" Jonathan's voice cracked with frustration that had clearly been building for hours. He grabbed for papers, trying to salvage what he could, his careful composure finally fracturing under the weight of exhaustion and pressure. In the chaos that followed, Lily tried to help, reaching for napkins from the sideboard, moving with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to managing small crises. But in her haste, she knocked against her school bag, and the poster board tumbled out, landing directly in the path of the spreading coffee. "No, Lily!" Jonathan's voice was sharper than Marcus had ever heard it, powered by panic over potentially ruined contracts rather than concern for his daughter's project. "Get away from the desk. Just let me handle this." But it was too late. The corner of Lily's family history project was already soaked, the careful photographs beginning to curl, her handwritten text blurring into illegible smears. Marcus watched her face crumple, not with tears, but with something worse, the total collapse of hope. "I'm sorry," she whispered, backing away from the desk as her father frantically tried to save his business documents. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to."
"It's fine, sweetheart," Jonathan said, but his attention was focused entirely on separating wet papers from dry ones, assessing the damage to documents that couldn't be replaced. "We'll figure it out. Why don't you go wait by the elevator? I'll just be a few more minutes." Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him as he watched Lily gather the ruined poster board, her small hands trembling as she tried to smooth out the water-damaged photographs. This wasn't just a minor domestic mishap. It was a perfect encapsulation of everything wrong with their relationship. The father, so consumed with providing financial security that he couldn't see his daughter's emotional needs. The daughter, so trained to be accommodating that she apologized for accidents that weren't her fault. As Lily walked toward the elevator, clutching the remains of her project, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He stepped out from behind his cleaning cart and called her name softly. "Miss Lily, wait." She turned, her face a mask of careful composure that couldn't quite hide the devastation underneath. Marcus approached slowly, the way he would with any wounded creature, and knelt down to her eye level. "Can I see what you are working on?" Lily hesitated, then carefully spread the poster board on the clean section of the conference table. Despite the water damage, Marcus could see that it was an extraordinary piece of work. She had created a visual timeline of her family, using old photographs, newspaper clippings, and her own artistic touches to tell the story of 3 generations. There were pictures of Jonathan's parents, her grandparents on both sides, and prominently featured throughout, images of her mother creating art, laughing, holding a baby Lily with obvious joy. But what made the project truly remarkable were the small origami elements Lily had incorporated throughout. Tiny paper flowers marking important dates, miniature cranes perched beside family photos, delicate butterflies that seemed to connect past and present with invisible threads of meaning. "This is beautiful," Marcus said, and meant it completely. "Tell me about this part here." For the next 10 minutes, as her father continued his frantic paper rescue behind them, Lily walked Marcus through her family history with the careful attention of a museum curator. She had interviewed relatives, researched family traditions, even tracked down some of her mother's old college friends who shared stories about Catherine's artistic vision and her dreams for her daughter's future. "Mama used to say that families were like origami," Lily explained, pointing to a section where she had written about her mother's philosophy in careful cursive. "She said that every person who joins the family adds a new fold, and that makes the whole structure stronger and more beautiful, even when some folds seem to go in different directions." Marcus's throat tightened. "What else did she say?" "She said that the most important thing wasn't having a perfect family, but having a family that pays attention to each other, that notices when someone is sad or scared or excited, and that takes time to really see what makes each person special." The words hung in the air between them, made more powerful by their obvious contrast to Lily's current reality. Behind them, Jonathan was making phone calls, arranging for document restoration services, completely absorbed in crisis management, while his daughter shared her most precious memories with the night janitor. "Would you like me to help you fix this?" Marcus asked, gesturing to the water-damaged sections. Lily's eyes brightened with hope, then dimmed with practiced disappointment. "I don't think it can be fixed. And besides, the presentation is tomorrow. Mrs. Kim says we get points taken off if our projects aren't neat and professional." Marcus studied the damage, his mind already working through possibilities. "What if I told you I know someone who might be able to help? Someone who understands about preserving precious things?" That someone was Mrs. Chen, who had spent decades restoring old photographs and documents for her neighbors. When Marcus called her that night after his shift, explaining the situation in careful detail, she didn't hesitate. "Bring the child to me tomorrow after school," she said firmly. "And bring good paper. We will make something beautiful from this disaster." But when Marcus tentatively suggested this plan to Lily the next evening, he discovered that the situation had become more complicated. Jonathan had hired a professional tutoring service to help Lily with organizational skills and project management, a well-meaning but misguided response to what he saw as his daughter's inability to complete assignments without mishaps. "Mrs. Patterson says I need to learn to be more careful," Lily explained, her voice carefully neutral. "She's going to help me create systems so accidents don't happen anymore." Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, not at Mrs. Patterson, who was probably a kind woman doing her best, but at the fundamental misunderstanding that had led to this moment. Lily didn't need systems to prevent accidents. She needed a father who would set aside his contracts long enough to appreciate her creativity, who would see the water damage as a minor inconvenience rather than a catastrophe, who would value her emotional well-being over the perfect presentation of school projects. But confronting Jonathan Hartwell directly was impossible. Marcus was just the night janitor, invisible and replaceable, with no standing to question the parenting decisions of one of the city's most powerful executives. He had to find another way. The solution came to him 3 days later, as he watched Lily struggling through another origami project under the watchful eye of Mrs. Patterson. The tutor was kind but firm, correcting every imperfect fold, insisting on precision over creativity, transforming the meditative art form into another academic exercise to be mastered rather than enjoyed. "Remember, Lily," Mrs. Patterson was saying, "the goal is to follow the instructions exactly. Deviation from the pattern leads to mistakes." Marcus watched Lily's shoulders tense as she attempted to fold a traditional crane according to the rigid specifications in a library book. Gone was the fluid grace he had observed in her earlier work, replaced by the mechanical precision of someone afraid to make errors. That night, after Mrs. Patterson had left and Lily sat alone with her technically perfect but somehow lifeless crane, Marcus made his boldest move yet. He sat down across from her and pulled out a sheet of his grandmother's special paper. Not the expensive origami paper he had been leaving for her, but the thin, almost transparent tissue his Bangwai had used for her most delicate work. "Want to see something your tutor probably wouldn't approve of?" he asked. Lily looked up with cautious interest. "What do you mean?" "Your mother was right about families being like origami," Marcus said, beginning to fold the delicate paper with movements that deliberately ignored traditional patterns. "But here's what the instruction books don't tell you. The most beautiful origami comes from listening to the paper itself, from letting it show you what it wants to become." As he worked, Marcus began to share stories his grandmother had told him, not just about proper folding techniques, but about the philosophy behind the art. How every piece of paper had its own character, its own strengths and weaknesses. How the master folders learned to work with imperfections rather than against them, finding ways to transform flaws into features that made each creation unique. "My Bangwai used to say that perfect origami was like a perfect life, beautiful to look at, but cold to touch. She said the cranes with little irregularities were the ones that carried the strongest wishes because they had been made by human hands with human hearts." When he finished, the result was unlike any crane Lily had seen. Asymmetrical, delicate, somehow more alive than the textbook perfect versions she had been producing under Mrs. Patterson's guidance. One wing was slightly larger than the other, a consequence of the tear Marcus had worked around. But rather than detracting from the design, it gave the bird a sense of movement, as if it were banking into a gentle turn.
"It's wrong," Lily said, but there was wonder in her voice rather than criticism. "Is it?" Marcus asked. "Or is it just different from what you expected?" Lily reached out tentatively, touching the crane's irregular wing with the tip of her finger. "It looks like it's really flying, like it's alive." "That's because it was made with love instead of fear," Marcus said. "Your mother understood that. She would have wanted you to remember that perfect doesn't always mean beautiful." The conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of the elevator, followed by Jonathan's familiar footsteps. Creating this type of meaningful story content requires significant time and effort to craft properly. If you're finding value in this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. But instead of hiding the crane or pretending to be absorbed in other work, Lily held it up as her father entered the office. "Daddy, look what Marcus taught me." Jonathan's expression was a complex mixture of surprise, confusion, and something that might have been irritation. His eyes moved from his daughter to Marcus, clearly trying to process this unexpected interaction between his child and the building's custodial staff. "That's very nice, sweetheart," he said carefully. "But you know you're supposed to be working on your homework with Mrs. Patterson, not playing games." "It wasn't a game," Lily said, her voice gaining strength from the solid weight of the crane in her hands. "Marcus was teaching me what Mama used to say about origami, about how the imperfect ones are sometimes more beautiful because they have stories." Marcus watched Jonathan's face carefully, seeing the moment when his daughter's words penetrated the armor of professional efficiency he wore like a second skin. For just an instant, grief flickered across his features, not the managed, compartmentalized grief he had learned to live with, but the raw, fresh pain of someone confronted with the reality of loss. "Your mother said that?" Jonathan's voice was softer now, uncertain in a way that Marcus had never heard before. "She said lots of things about making beautiful things from ordinary paper. Marcus knows some of the same stories. He learned them from his grandmother, just like I learned from Mama." Jonathan looked at Marcus again, and this time there was something different in his gaze. Not the polite dismissal he usually offered service personnel,
but genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been gratitude. "I didn't realize," Jonathan said slowly, "that Lily had been talking to you about her mother." Marcus chose his words carefully, aware that this moment could either open a door or close it permanently. "She's a remarkable young lady with a lot of wisdom about art and beauty. I imagine she gets that from both her parents." The comment was designed to acknowledge Jonathan's role, while gently suggesting that Lily's current needs weren't being fully met. Marcus watched the CEO process this delicate observation, seeing the gears of an analytical mind working through implications and possibilities. What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including Jonathan himself. Instead of dismissing the conversation or redirecting Lily's attention to her homework, Jonathan sat down at the conference table and picked up one of the squares of origami paper that Marcus had left for his daughter. "Show me," he said simply.
Attempts were clumsy at first, his fingers, accustomed to keyboards and contract signatures, struggling with the delicate movements required for origami. But Lily coached him with patient enthusiasm, and gradually his cranes began to take recognizable shape. Marcus found himself in the strange position of facilitating a conversation between father and daughter that should have been happening naturally, but had somehow been lost in the daily urgencies of survival and success. As Jonathan grew more comfortable with the folding, he began to ask questions, not about technique, but about the stories behind the art form, the traditions Lily was learning, the memories she was preserving. "Your mother never taught me any of this," Jonathan admitted as he struggled with a particularly complex fold. "I always thought it was just something you two did together, a private thing between mother and daughter." "She wanted to teach you," Lily said quietly, "but you were always busy." The words hung in the air like an indictment, made more powerful by their complete lack of accusation. Lily wasn't trying to hurt her father. She was simply stating a fact, the way a child might observe that the sky was blue or that water was wet. Jonathan's hand stilled on his half-formed crane. "She did?" "She used to say that origami was like meditation, and that you needed meditation more than anyone because you carried so much worry." Lily's voice was matter-of-fact, but Marcus could see the careful way she was watching her father's face, gauging his reaction to these revealed secrets. "What else did she say about me?" Jonathan asked, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that made Marcus realize this conversation was long overdue. As Lily began to share her mother's observations about her father, his kindness, his dedication to providing for his family, his tendency to sacrifice his own happiness for others' security, Marcus quietly gathered his cleaning supplies and began to move toward the door. This was a conversation that needed to happen without an audience, a moment of connection that had been delayed too long by the practical demands of daily survival and success. But as he reached the elevator, he heard Jonathan call his name. He turned to find the CEO standing in the doorway of his office, his expression serious, but no longer guarded. "Marcus, I owe you an apology." "For what, sir?" "For not seeing what was happening right in front of me. For not realizing that my daughter has been having the most important conversations of her day with—" He paused, clearly struggling with how to characterize their relationship. "With someone who pays attention," Marcus supplied gently. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Yes, with someone who pays attention." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime, during regular business hours? I think there are some things we should discuss." As Marcus rode the elevator down to the parking garage that night, he carried with him the image of father and daughter sitting together at the conference table, their heads bent over paper cranes, finally engaged in the kind of conversation that Catherine Hartwell had dreamed they would have. It wasn't a complete transformation. There were still larger systemic issues to address, patterns of neglect that couldn't be fixed in a single evening of origami lessons. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, Marcus reflected as he drove through the empty streets toward home, beginnings were the most important folded shapes of all. The coffee meeting that Jonathan Hartwell suggested took place on a Tuesday morning at a small cafe 3 blocks from Meridian Tower. Neutral territory that allowed both men to meet as equals rather than employer and employee. Marcus arrived 10 minutes early, nursing a cup of coffee that cost more than he usually spent on lunch, and trying to prepare himself for a conversation that could change everything or nothing, depending on how carefully he navigated the complex dynamics at play.
Jonathan arrived precisely on time, looking different in daylight than he did in the fluorescent-lit offices of Meridian Tower. The expensive suit was still there, but something in his posture suggested exhaustion rather than authority, vulnerability rather than corporate confidence. He ordered a double espresso and sat down across from Marcus with the careful movements of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jonathan began without preamble, "about paying attention, and I've been wondering how long I've been failing at the most important job I have." Marcus chose his words carefully. "I don't think you're failing, Mr. Hartwell. I think you're doing the best you can under circumstances that would challenge anyone. Are you always this diplomatic?" There was a slight smile in Jonathan's voice, the first hint of humor Marcus had ever heard from him. "Occupational hazard of working the night shift. You learn to see people when they think nobody's watching. Most of the time, we're all just trying to figure it out as we go along." Jonathan stared into his espresso cup for a long moment. Catherine used to say something similar. She said that the hardest part of being a parent wasn't making the big decisions. It was paying attention to all the small moments that actually shape a child's understanding of the world. The mention of his late wife seemed to unlock something in Jonathan, and over the next hour, he shared pieces of a story that painted a much more complex picture than Marcus had imagined. Catherine's illness hadn't just been a medical crisis, it had been a financial catastrophe that had threatened to destroy everything they had built together. The medical bills, the lost income from her closed studio, the costs of experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, all of it had combined to create a debt burden that still dominated Jonathan's daily decisions. "I work 18-hour days because I have to," Jonathan explained, his voice tight with the stress of constant financial pressure. "The life insurance policy helped, but it wasn't enough to cover everything. And now I'm trapped in this cycle where I can't reduce my workload because we need the income, but the more I work, the less available I am for Lily, which means I'm failing at the one thing Catherine would have cared about most." Marcus felt the familiar weight of recognition. How many single parents were trapped in similar impossible equations? How many children were paying the price for economic systems that force parents to choose between financial stability and emotional availability? "What do you think Catherine would want you to do?" Marcus asked gently. "She would want me to quit my job and become a full-time father. She never understood the practical constraints, the reality of what it takes to maintain the lifestyle she wanted for Lily." "Are you sure about that?" Marcus pressed. "Because from what Lily tells me, your wife seemed to understand quite a bit about what actually matters." The conversation was interrupted by Jonathan's phone, buzzing with the insistent urgency that had defined his life for the past 18 months. He glanced at the screen, and Marcus watched his face transform back into the mask of professional efficiency. "I have to take this," Jonathan said apologetically. "Emergency board meeting. The Nakamura deal is falling apart." As he answered the phone and began speaking in rapid, clipped sentences about contract negotiations and damage control, Marcus realized that this was exactly what Catherine had been warning against, not the necessity of work itself, but the way that constant crisis management had become a substitute for actually living.
The phone call lasted 20 minutes, during which Jonathan's coffee grew cold and his stress level visibly increased. When he finally hung up, he looked like a man who had aged years in the span of a single conversation. "This is what I mean," he said, running his hands through his hair. "There's always one more fire to put out, one more crisis that can't wait.
And meanwhile, Lily is sitting in my office every evening, folding paper birds and waiting for me to notice that she exists." "What if she didn't have to wait in your office?" Marcus asked. "What if there were other options?" Jonathan looked confused. "Like what? Daycare? She's too old for most programs and too young to be home alone. And I can't afford a full-time nanny, not with the current debt load." Marcus had been thinking about this question for weeks, ever since he realized the full scope of Lily's isolation. What if she spent her after-school hours somewhere that understood her interests, somewhere that could nurture her artistic abilities while giving her the structure she needs? "You mean like an art program?" Jonathan's voice carried a note of interest mixed with skepticism. "I've looked into those. The good ones have waiting lists, and the affordable ones are—" He trailed off, clearly struggling with the implications of his financial limitations. "What if I told you I might know someone who could help?" Marcus said carefully. "Someone who has experience with children and art, and who might be willing to work within your budget constraints." The someone Marcus had in mind was Mrs. Chen, whose apartment had become an informal gathering place for neighborhood children whose parents worked late shifts. She had been talking for months about formalizing her after-school program, creating a structured environment where kids could get help with homework while also exploring creative pursuits. But as Marcus began to explain the possibility, he realized that Jonathan was listening with only half his attention. The CEO's eyes kept drifting to his phone, his mind clearly calculating the implications of the morning's crisis call. "That sounds interesting," Jonathan said, but his tone suggested that he was already mentally back in the conference room, dealing with whatever disaster threatened his latest business deal. "Why don't you send me some information? I'll look it over when things calm down." Marcus felt a familiar frustration. This was exactly the pattern that had created the problem in the first place. Jonathan's inability to prioritize his daughter's immediate needs over the endless series of professional emergencies that defined his existence. "Mr. Hartwell," said Marcus, his voice firmer than usual, "when do you think things will calm down?" Jonathan looked startled by the directness of the question. "I don't know. After the Nakamura situation is resolved. Maybe after the quarterly review? Definitely by the end of the fiscal year." "And what happens to Lily while you're waiting for things to calm down?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Jonathan stared at Marcus for a long moment, and in that silence, something fundamental shifted. Marcus watched the CEO's face as he processed the implications of his own words. The way his automatic responses revealed the depth of his trapped thinking. "You're right," Jonathan said finally. "There's never going to be a good time. There's always going to be another crisis, another deadline, another fire to put out. And Catherine used to say that I treated our family like a project to be managed rather than a life to be lived." "What would it look like to change that?" Marcus asked. The question sparked a conversation that neither man had expected when they sat down together that morning. Jonathan began to talk about the dreams he had abandoned when Catherine got sick, not grand professional ambitions, but simple domestic hopes. Weekend camping trips with Lily, teaching her to ride a bike in Golden Gate Park, reading bedtime stories that weren't squeezed in between conference calls and crisis management sessions.
"I used to be good at being present," Jonathan said, his voice carrying a note of wonder, as if he were remembering a person he used to know. Before the medical bills, before the debt, before everything became about survival, I used to sit with Lily and just watch her play. I used to know all her favorite books, all her fears and dreams and silly theories about how the world worked. "What changed?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Fear," Jonathan said simply. "Fear that if I didn't work constantly, we would lose everything. Fear that slowing down meant failing Catherine's memory. Fear that choosing family time over work time made me selfish and irresponsible." Marcus recognized the pattern because he had lived it himself during the months after his divorce, when every decision felt like a choice between Emma's emotional needs and their financial security. What if choosing family time was actually the most responsible thing you could do? Jonathan looked skeptical. How do you figure that? Because children who grow up feeling valued and heard become adults who can handle whatever challenges life throws at them, Marcus said. And children who grow up feeling like burdens become adults who don't know how to ask for help when they need it. The observation seemed to hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Is that what Lily feels like? A burden? Marcus thought about the careful way Lily apologized for accidents that weren't her fault, the way she made herself small and quiet to avoid adding to her father's stress. I think she feels like someone whose needs are always secondary to more important things. Jonathan was quiet for a long time, staring out the cafe window at the stream of professionals hurrying past with briefcases and determined expressions. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I've been so focused on providing for her future that I forgot to give her a present worth remembering. The admission seemed to break something open in him, and for the next 20 minutes, Jonathan talked about Lily with the passionate attention of a father who was seeing his daughter clearly for the first time in months. He described her artistic abilities, her quiet wisdom, her remarkable resilience in the face of loss. He talked about moments of connection they had shared, brief but precious intervals when work crises hadn't intruded on their time together. She has this way of seeing beauty in things that most people would overlook, Jonathan said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about his daughter's gifts. Last month, she spent an entire afternoon photographing shadows on the sidewalk because she said they looked like abstract paintings. And she was right. They were beautiful. When was the last time you told her that? When was the last time you really looked at something she created and talked to her about what inspired it? Jonathan's face crumpled slightly. I can't remember. There's always been something more urgent, something that couldn't wait. He paused, then added, but her art can't wait either, can it? Childhood can't wait. The realization seemed to galvanize him in a way that Marcus hadn't expected. Instead of the defeated acceptance he had anticipated, Jonathan's expression took on the focused intensity that probably made him successful in business. What would Miss Chen's program involve, and what would you need from me to make it work? The question launched them into a detailed discussion about practical possibilities. Miss Chen's informal after-school program could be expanded to include art instruction, homework support, and the kind of creative exploration that Lily craved. The cost would be minimal. Miss Chen was more interested in community building than profit, but it would require Jonathan to trust his daughter's care to people outside his immediate control.
The hardest part, Marcus said carefully, might be learning to let go of the idea that you have to manage every aspect of Lily's life personally. She needs to know that other adults care about her well-being, that she has value beyond her relationship to you. Jonathan nodded slowly. Catherine used to say something similar. She said that children needed to feel like they belonged to the whole world, not just to their parents' anxiety. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Jonathan pulled out his phone and did something that surprised Marcus. He turned it off completely. I'm going to pick Lily up from school today, he announced, in person, and we're going to go somewhere together, not to run errands or check items off a to-do list, but just to spend time with each other. Marcus felt something warm expand in his chest. Where will you go? I don't know. I'll ask her what she wants to do. Jonathan smiled, and for the first time since Marcus had known him, the expression seemed completely genuine. I'm going to pay attention to what she says, and then we're going to do it. As they shook hands outside the cafe, Marcus realized that he was witnessing more than just a parenting epiphany. He was seeing a man rediscover what it meant to live deliberately, to make choices based on values rather than fears, to prioritize connection over productivity. But the real test would come that evening, when the inevitable work crisis demanded Jonathan's attention, when the choice between family time and financial security became more than theoretical. Marcus had seen too many good intentions dissolve under the pressure of economic necessity to feel completely optimistic about Jonathan's transformation.
Still, as he watched the CEO walk back toward Meridian Tower with a lighter step than usual, Marcus allowed himself to hope that this time might be different. Because sometimes, the most important changes began with a single decision: to pay attention, to choose presence over productivity, to value the irreplaceable over the merely urgent. That evening, Marcus arrived at work to find Jonathan's office empty except for a single origami crane sitting on the mahogany desk, not one of Lily's technically perfect creations, but a slightly lopsided bird that bore the unmistakable signs of beginner's hands, guided by love rather than expertise. Beside it was a note in Jonathan handwriting: "Thank you for helping me remember that the most important meetings are the ones that happen at kitchen tables, not in conference rooms." Lily and I spent the afternoon at the aquarium. She taught me that seahorses mate for life, and I taught her that fathers can learn to do better. J.H. Marcus stood in the empty office for a long moment, holding the note and the imperfect crane, feeling the weight of small victories and uncertain futures. Change was never as simple as a single conversation or a perfect moment of understanding. Real transformation required daily choices, constant vigilance against old patterns, the courage to keep choosing love over fear even when fear felt more practical. But for tonight, it was enough to know that somewhere across the city, a father and daughter were probably folding paper birds together, learning to see each other clearly for the first time in months. It was enough to know that paying attention could still work miracles, even in a world that seemed designed to reward distraction. And as Marcus began his cleaning rounds, he found himself humming softly, a Vietnamese lullaby his grandmother had sung while they folded cranes by candlelight, a song about birds that carried wishes between the earth and sky, about the patient magic that transformed ordinary paper into windows for the soul.
Marcus had become an unofficial instructor, teaching origami twice a week while Mrs. Chen handled homework supervision and other artistic pursuits. But the real magic happened in the spaces between formal instruction, when children who had never heard of each other's cultures began sharing stories and techniques, creating fusion art that reflected their diverse backgrounds. Lily thrived in this environment in ways that surprised even Marcus. Away from the sterile perfection of her father's office, she revealed herself to be not just talented, but generous, patiently teaching younger children the basic folds while learning from the older ones about different artistic traditions. She had become the unofficial ambassador between the shy newcomers and the established group, using her origami skills as a bridge to help everyone feel welcome. "She has your gift," Mrs. Chen told Marcus one afternoon as they watched Lily guide a 6-year-old through her first paper crane. "Not just for folding, but for seeing what people need and providing it without making them feel small." The observation was accurate. Lily had developed an intuitive understanding of which children needed encouragement, which ones required gentle correction, and which ones simply needed someone to witness their efforts without judgment. She moved through the group with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the world. But the most significant change was in her relationship with her father. Jonathan had kept his promise about prioritizing presence over productivity, though the transition hadn't been smooth. The first few weeks had been marked by relapses into old patterns, work crises that demanded immediate attention, evening meetings that couldn't be rescheduled, the magnetic pull of professional obligations that felt more urgent than family time. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging evening when the Nakamura deal had collapsed entirely, threatening not just Meridian Tower's quarterly projections, but Jonathan's position as CEO. Jonathan arrived at work to find Jonathan sitting in his office at 11 p.m., surrounded by legal documents and crisis management plans, his phone buzzing with calls from lawyers and board members. But instead of the familiar scene of Lily folding alone while her father conducted emergency business, Marcus discovered father and daughter sitting together at the conference table, working side by side on their respective projects. Jonathan was reviewing contracts while Lily practiced a complex origami technique, But every few minutes, one would pause to comment on the other's work, creating a rhythm of shared attention that transformed the sterile office into something resembling a family workspace. "We compromised," Lily explained when Marcus expressed surprise at their arrangement. "Daddy needs to work late sometimes because his job is important, but he also needs to remember that I'm important too. So now, when he has to work really late, I come with him and we work together." The solution was simple but revolutionary. Instead of treating work and family as competing priorities, they have found a way to honor both, creating space for connection within the constraints of professional necessity. Jonathan still worked long hours, but he did so with conscious intention rather than unconscious compulsion, building in moments of presence that kept him connected to what mattered most. "The funny thing is, I'm actually more productive this way," Jonathan told Marcus during one of their regular coffee meetings, which had become a monthly tradition. "When I know I have limited time before Lily needs attention, I focus better. I make decisions more quickly instead of second-guessing everything." The change had rippled outward beyond just their personal relationship. Other executives at Meridian Tower had begun to notice Jonathan's new approach to work-life integration, and some had started implementing similar strategies with their own families. The executive floor, once a monument to corporate isolation, had begun to show signs of human warmth. Family photos appeared on desks, children's artwork was displayed in offices, and the occasional sound of laughter could be heard during evening hours.
Experiences and corporate partnerships. The centerpiece of the evening would be an origami exhibition featuring the work of Mrs. Chen's after-school program. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan addressed the crowd of executives, board members, and community leaders from the podium. "Tonight, I want to share something with you that has fundamentally changed how I understand success." The ballroom fell silent as Lily stepped onto the stage beside her father, carrying a large display case filled with intricate origami creations. But these weren't just decorative objects. Each piece was labeled with the story of its creator, the challenges they had overcome, the dreams they were pursuing through their art. 6 months ago, my daughter was spending her evenings alone in my office, creating beautiful art that I was too busy to notice, Jonathan continued, his voice carrying across the elegant space with an unusual vulnerability. "I thought I was being a good father by providing for her material needs, but I was failing at the most basic requirement of parenthood, paying attention." He gestured toward the display case where Lily was carefully arranging the origami pieces with the practiced grace of a museum curator. "These aren't just paper sculptures. They're proof that beauty can emerge from the most ordinary materials when someone takes the time to see potential instead of problems, possibility instead of limitations." The audience was unusually attentive, drawn in by Jonathan's departure from the typical corporate script. Marcus watched from the back of the room, still somewhat amazed to find himself invited to an event where he would normally be working behind the scenes, invisible and unnoticed. "The artist who taught my daughter and me about the transformative power of paying attention is here with us tonight. Marcus Chen works the night shift at Meridian Tower, cleaning our offices and maintaining our workspace, but he's also a teacher, a mentor, and someone who understands that the most important work we do is often the work that never appears on any performance review." Marcus felt every eye in the room turn toward him, and for a moment, the familiar urge to remain invisible nearly overwhelmed him. But then he caught sight of Lily smiling at him from the stage, her expression bright with pride and affection. And he realized that visibility wasn't always something to be feared. Marcus carries on a tradition that his grandmother taught him, the understanding that art isn't just about creating beautiful objects, but about creating connections between people, bridges across differences, reminders that we all share the same fundamental human needs for recognition, respect, and love. The speech that followed wasn't just about origami or after-school programs. It was about the hidden infrastructure of care that made corporate success possible, the often invisible workers who maintained the spaces where deals were made and fortunes were built. Jonathan talked about Mrs. Chen's program as a model for how businesses could support their communities, not just through charitable donations, but through genuine partnerships that recognize the expertise and wisdom of people from all backgrounds. Tonight, instead of bidding on golf packages and wine collections, we're asking you to invest in something more valuable: the creative potential of children who need someone to believe in their abilities. The fundraising portion of the evening was unlike anything Marcus had ever witnessed at a corporate event. Instead of competitive displays of wealth, there was something closer to genuine community building, as executives and their spouses listened to children explain their artistic projects and shared stories about their own creative aspirations. The culmination of the evening came when Lily demonstrated the crane folding technique that had started everything, teaching a room full of powerful adults to transform flat paper into three-dimensional beauty. Marcus watched CEOs and board members struggle with the same basic folds that had challenged Jonathan months earlier, their expensive suits and manicured hands working carefully to create something simple and perfect. The secret, Lily told her audience of attentive adults, is to be patient with the paper and patient with yourself. Every fold matters, but mistakes can become features if you're creative enough to work with them instead of against them. The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone in the room. As corporate leaders struggled with origami basics, they were also grappling with larger questions about patience, creativity, and the value of processes that couldn't be rushed or optimized.
The evening raised more money for Mrs. Chen's program than any previous charity auction. But more importantly, it created a network of support that extended far beyond financial contributions. Several executives offered professional skills, legal advice for nonprofit incorporation, marketing expertise for community outreach, connections with other educational programs that could share resources and strategies. But perhaps the most significant outcome was a decision by Meridian Tower's board of directors to implement a company-wide initiative called Folding Forward, a program that would provide paid time off for employees who wanted to volunteer with community arts programs, along with funding for creative workshops that would be held in the building's common areas. We're not just changing how we think about corporate social responsibility, Jonathan explained to Marcus during one of their coffee meetings. We're changing how we think about work itself. What if instead of treating creativity as something that happens outside office hours, we recognized it as essential to innovation and problem solving? The question reflected a transformation that went beyond individual behavior change to systemic cultural shift. Marcus began teaching monthly origami workshops in Meridian Tower's lobby, open to all employees and their families. The sessions became so popular that they had to be moved to the larger conference room and eventually spawned additional programs: calligraphy classes led by Mrs. Chen, photography workshops facilitated by local artists, even a community garden on the building's roof. 6 months after that first evening, when Lily had smiled at her perfect crane, Marcus found himself standing in front of a room full of executives, teaching them the same folds his grandmother had shared with him decades earlier. But the real miracle wasn't the corporate enthusiasm for ancient art forms. It was the way that paying attention to one child's needs had created space for everyone to remember their own creative capacity. Emma had become a regular visitor to Mrs. Chen's program, forming an unlikely friendship with Lily despite their different backgrounds. The two girls collaborated on increasingly ambitious projects, teaching each other techniques and sharing stories about their mothers. Emma about Sarah's support for her artistic dreams, Lily about Catherine's belief in the power of beauty to heal wounded hearts. "They're good for each other," Mrs. Chen observed as they watched the girls work on a collaborative installation, a flock of paper birds suspended from fishing line, each crane carrying a small LED light that made the whole assembly glow like a constellation. Marcus nodded, thinking about the unexpected connections that had emerged from his decision to leave origami paper on a lonely child's desk.
Emma had gained a friend who understood the serious work of art making, while Lily had found someone who could teach her that creativity could be joyful as well as meaningful. But the most profound change was in Marcus himself. The regular teaching at Meridian Tower had led to other opportunities: workshops at community centers, collaborations with local schools, even an invitation to speak at a conference about the therapeutic applications of traditional crafts. He had begun to see himself not just as someone who cleaned up after other people's lives, but as someone who contributed actively to his community's well-being. "You have found your calling," Sarah observed during one of Emma's weekend visits when Marcus was preparing materials for the next day's workshop. "I haven't seen you this energized about anything since—" She paused, clearly thinking about the early days of their relationship when Marcus had talked passionately about his woodworking, his dreams of creating functional art that would last for generations. "Since I remembered that making things beautiful is actual work, important work, even if it doesn't pay much." The financial reality hadn't changed dramatically. Marcus still worked his night shift at Meridian Tower, still picked up odd jobs during the day to make ends meet. But the teaching had given him something more valuable than additional income, a sense of purpose that transformed even his custodial work into something meaningful.
When he cleaned the offices now, he wasn't just maintaining other people's workspace. He was caring for a community that had become his extended family. The executives who stayed late for crisis management knew his name now, asked about his teaching, sometimes stopped by his workshops with their own children. The invisible barriers that had once separated service workers from office professionals had become more permeable, replaced by a recognition of shared humanity and mutual respect. The transformation was perhaps most visible in Jonathan and Lily's relationship, which had evolved from dutiful coexistence to genuine partnership. They had developed their own routines and traditions: Sunday morning origami sessions while waiting for bagels to toast, evening walks through Golden Gate Park where they collected interesting leaves to use in collage projects, regular visits to art museums where Lily explained contemporary installations to her father with the expertise of someone who understood creativity from the inside out. "She's becoming the person Catherine always hoped she would be," Jonathan told Marcus during one of their coffee meetings, his voice filled with wonder at his daughter's continued growth. "Confident, generous, curious about everything. But more than that, she's helping me become the father Catherine always hoped I could be." The success of the programs had attracted attention from local media, leading to a feature article in the San Francisco Chronicle titled "The Janitor Who Taught a CEO to Fold." Marcus had been uncomfortable with the attention at first, worried that the focus on his individual story would overshadow the larger community effort that had made everything possible. But Mrs. Chen had convinced him that sharing the story served a larger purpose. "People need to know that transformation is possible," she said, "that paying attention to one child can change an entire community, that art and beauty aren't luxuries for people who have solved all their practical problems, they're necessities for anyone who wants to live fully." The article had led to speaking invitations, consultation requests from other corporations interested in implementing similar programs, and, most surprisingly, a documentary proposal from a filmmaker who wanted to explore the intersection of art, labor, and community building. "We want to show how creativity can be a form of social justice," the filmmaker explained during their initial meeting. "How teaching someone to see beauty in ordinary materials can be a radical act in a culture that only values certain kinds of achievement." Marcus had agreed to participate, but only on the condition that the documentary would feature the entire community that had made the transformation possible: Mrs. Chen's wisdom and generosity, Lily's courage in reaching across cultural differences, Jonathan's willingness to admit his mistakes and change course, Emma's joyful enthusiasm for collaborative creation. The filming process had been both humbling and illuminating, forcing Marcus to articulate ideas that he had previously understood only intuitively. Why did origami matter? How did teaching someone to fold paper become a form of social activism? What was the connection between individual creativity and community well-being? The answers had emerged slowly, through conversations with participants and reflection on his own transformation. Origami mattered because it taught patience in a culture obsessed with speed, precision in a world of careless consumption, beauty in an environment that often felt harsh and unforgiving. Teaching someone to fold paper became activism when it reminded them that they had the power to transform ordinary materials into something extraordinary, that their hands could create rather than just consume. And the connection between individual creativity and community well-being was perhaps the most important insight of all. When people felt valued for their unique gifts, rather than judged for their limitations, they became more generous, more patient, more willing to extend care and attention to others. 5 years later, Marcus stood in the lobby of what was now called the Lily Hartwell Community Arts Center, the former Meridian Tower, transformed through a combination of corporate restructuring and community vision into something unprecedented in the city's business district. The gleaming marble floors still reflected expensive lighting, but the walls now displayed rotating exhibitions from local artists, and the air hummed with creative energy rather than just commercial ambition.
The transformation had begun when Jonathan made the radical decision to relocate Meridian Corporation's headquarters to a smaller, more efficient space across town, then donated the 40-story tower to the city with the stipulation that it be converted into a center for community arts education. The upper floors housed artist studios, the middle floors contained classrooms and workshops, and the ground level had become a gallery and performance space that was open to the public year-round. "Can you believe we used to think this was just a building where people worked?" Lily asked, joining Marcus near the information desk where she was volunteering during her winter break from Stanford University. At 13, she had grown into the confident, creative young woman her mother had dreamed she might become, passionate about social justice, fluent in 4 languages, and still unmatched in her ability to fold paper into impossible shapes. Marcus smiled, remembering the lonely child who had once sat in her father's office, creating beauty in solitude. "I think your mother would have loved seeing what this place became." "She would have loved seeing what you helped it become," Lily corrected gently. "Dad always says that everything changed the night you decided to leave origami paper on my desk, instead of just emptying the trash and moving on." The observation was both accurate and incomplete. Yes, that decision had set events in motion, but the real transformation had required contributions from dozens of people over years of sustained effort. Mrs. Chen, now 88 and still teaching calligraphy to anyone willing to learn patience. Jonathan, who had discovered that running a nonprofit foundation was more fulfilling than managing corporate acquisitions. Emma, now 15 and planning to study art therapy in college. Even Sarah, who had started a support group for single parents interested in incorporating creativity into their children's education. "Your dad gives me too much credit," Marcus said. "All I did was pay attention to something that was already beautiful." "But that's everything, isn't it?" Lily's voice carried the philosophical sophistication that had been developing since childhood. "Most people walk through the world without really seeing what's in front of them. They miss the beauty that's already there because they're too busy looking for something else." The insight reflected years of conversation and collaboration between them. Lily had become Marcus's unofficial assistant in many of his teaching projects, helping to develop curricula that combined traditional origami techniques with contemporary social justice themes. Their workshops now included sessions on folding for peace, where participants created collaborative installations about conflict resolution, and paper and memory,
which helped immigrant families share their cultural traditions through adapted origami techniques. The success of these programs had attracted national attention, leading to grants from major foundations and partnerships with universities studying the intersection of art and community development. Marcus had eventually been hired as the center's Director of Community Engagement, a position that allowed him to use his custodial experience to understand how physical spaces could be designed to support human flourishing. "Mr. Chen?" a voice interrupted his conversation with Lily. He turned to find a young woman in her 20s, holding a stack of origami paper and looking slightly nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm starting a program for homeless youth, and I wondered if you might have time to teach some of my volunteers basic folding techniques." The request was typical of the dozens Marcus received each month. The origami workshops had become a model that was being replicated in communities across the country, adapted for different populations and specific needs. He had consulted on programs in juvenile detention centers, senior communities, refugee resettlement organizations, and corporate retreat centers where executives were learning to use creative practice as a form of stress management. "I'd be happy to help," Marcus told the young woman, pulling out his calendar to schedule a training session. "But I'd also like to connect you with some of the young people here who have been teaching for a few years. They might have insights about working with your population that I wouldn't think of."
Traditional folding techniques often understood community building in ways that surprised professional social workers. The beautiful thing about this work, Marcus had told the documentary filmmaker during their final interview, is that everyone involved becomes both teacher and student. I learned as much from Lily about patience and precision as she learned from me about technique and tradition. The documentary, Paperbirds, A Story of Transformation, had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and gone on to win several awards for its nuanced portrayal of how individual relationships could create systemic change. But more importantly, it had inspired communities around the world to explore how traditional crafts could be used to address contemporary social challenges. Marcus had received letters from teachers in rural Kentucky who were using origami to help students understand geometry, from therapists in urban Detroit who were incorporating paper folding into trauma recovery programs, from community organizers in small towns across the Midwest who had discovered that craft workshops created safe spaces for difficult conversations about race and class. Every time someone learns to fold their first crane, Marcus had written in response to one such letter, they're discovering that they have the power to transform ordinary materials into something beautiful. That's a lesson that extends far beyond paper crafts. The afternoon light streaming through the center's floor-to-ceiling windows was particularly beautiful that day, casting shadows that reminded Marcus of the patterns he had first noticed during his night shift years earlier. But now, instead of cleaning around those shadows, he was teaching a group of children to incorporate them into their paper sculptures, showing them how to use natural light as an element in their artistic compositions. Emma had joined the workshop via video call from her college dorm room, where she was studying the therapeutic applications of art making. Her research project focused on the neurological effects of repetitive creative activities like origami, and she was documenting how folding practice could help reduce anxiety and improve focus in students with attention disorders. "Dad, show them the technique where you use the shadow to guide the fold. That's the one that Mom says helped her the most when she was feeling overwhelmed during the divorce." The casual reference to family history reflected the way painful memories had been transformed into wisdom through years of processing and creativity. Sarah had become a regular participant in the center's adult programs, finding that art making helped her navigate the ongoing challenges of single parenthood while also providing a space for her own creative expression. "The thing about origami," Sarah had told Marcus during one of their co-parenting conversations, "is that it teaches you to work with what you have instead of wishing for different materials. There's something profound about that when you're trying to build a life from the pieces of previous dreams." The observation captured something essential about the philosophy that had emerged from years of community art making. Instead of treating creativity as an escape from difficult realities, the programs at the center emphasized how artistic practice could provide tools for engaging more skillfully with challenges and complexity. As the afternoon workshop concluded, Marcus found himself thinking about his grandmother, wondering what she would make of the trajectory that had grown from her patient origami lessons decades earlier. Would she be surprised that a skill she had taught to help a lonely child cope with immigration and displacement had eventually become the foundation for a community center that served thousands of people each year? Probably not, he decided. Bangawai had understood something that Marcus was still learning, that the most ordinary activities could become extraordinary when they were shared with genuine attention and care. Her origami lessons hadn't just been about paper folding, they had been about patience, precision, respect for materials, and the profound satisfaction that came from creating beauty with your own hands.
She knew, Marcus said quietly, holding a crane that one of the workshop participants had left behind, slightly imperfect, unmistakably made with love. Knew what? Lily asked, joining him as they prepared to close the workshop space for the evening. That every fold connects us to something larger than ourselves. That teaching someone to make something beautiful is one of the most important things we can do for each other. Lily nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. At 13, she had already begun thinking about her own future contributions, the way she might carry forward the traditions of community building and creative education that had shaped her childhood. Next month, I'm starting a pen pal program with kids in refugee camps, she told Marcus as they walked toward the elevator. The idea is to teach origami through letters and photos, so that children who can't meet in person can still share artistic techniques and cultural traditions. The project was typical of Lily's approach to problem solving, ambitious, compassionate, and grounded in real understanding of how creative practice could build bridges across seemingly impossible distances. She had inherited her mother's artistic vision and her father's strategic thinking, but had developed her own unique capacity for seeing connections that others missed. "Your mother would be so proud," Marcus said, meeting it completely. "I think she'd be proud of all of us, not just for what we've accomplished, but for how we've learned to take care of each other." 10 years later, Marcus received an invitation that brought tears to his eyes. Lily's graduation from medical school, where she had specialized in art therapy for children facing trauma and loss. The invitation included a photo of her teaching origami to young patients in a pediatric oncology ward, their small faces bright with concentration and hope as they transformed flat paper into three-dimensional promises of possibility. Dr. Hartwell will be joining the staff at UCSF Children's Hospital, where she will be establishing the Katherine Hartwell Center for Creative Healing, a program that will integrate traditional crafts with evidence-based therapeutic techniques. The center would be the first of its kind, combining rigorous medical research with the ancient wisdom of making beautiful things as a pathway to emotional resilience. Her dissertation had documented the measurable effects of origami practice on children's ability to cope with medical procedures, manage anxiety, and maintain hope during extended treatment protocols. Every child deserves to know that they can create something beautiful, even when everything else feels broken, Lily had written in her thesis conclusion. And every adult needs to remember that paying attention to children's creativity isn't just nice to do. It's essential work that can literally save lives. The research had attracted international attention, leading to partnerships with medical schools around the world and funding for similar programs in communities that had never had access to art-based therapeutic interventions. But for Marcus, the most meaningful outcome was simpler. The knowledge that a skill his grandmother had taught him to process grief and displacement had become a tool that would help countless children navigate their own challenges with greater resilience and hope. 15 years after that first night when Lily had smiled at her paper crane, Marcus stood in his apartment kitchen, teaching his own granddaughter the same folds his Bangwai had shared with him decades earlier. Emma's daughter, 3-year-old Catherine, named for the woman who had inspired so much transformation, had her great-grandmother's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn determination to master every fold perfectly. "Jeje, why do the birds have wishes inside them?" Catherine asked, using the Chinese term for grandfather that Emma had taught her. Marcus smiled, remembering asking his grandmother similar questions. "Because when you make something beautiful with your whole heart, you put part of your soul into it. And souls always carry wishes." "What kind of wishes?"
the best kind. Wishes for other people to be happy and safe and loved. Catherine nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense. At 3, she was already showing signs of the artistic sensitivity that seemed to run in families that valued creativity. Her drawing
Covered Emma's refrigerator. Her Play-Doh sculptures occupied places of honor on the dining room table, and her questions about color and shape suggested someone who would spend her life making the world more beautiful. Outside the kitchen window, the city lights twinkled like stars, and Marcus found himself thinking about all the paper birds that had been folded since that first crane brought a lonely child her first smile in months. Thousands of workshops, hundreds of teachers, countless moments of connection between people who had learned to see beauty in ordinary materials and possibility in unexpected places. The work continued in ways both large and small. The Lily Hartwell Community Arts Center had spawned similar programs in dozens of cities. Mrs. Chen's approach to intergenerational learning had been studied and replicated by universities around the world. Jonathan's model of corporate social responsibility had influenced business practices across multiple industries. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest: the understanding that every human being possessed the capacity to create beauty, and that recognizing and nurturing this capacity was one of the most profound forms of social justice available. 20 years later, Marcus received a package that made him laugh and cry simultaneously. Inside was an origami crane folded from what appeared to be a medical chart, along with a note from Dr. Lily Hartwell. Dear Marcus, last week I taught origami to a 5-year-old boy named David who was scared about his upcoming surgery. He made this crane from his old test results and told me it was carrying a wish that all the other sick kids would get better too. I thought you should have it, since you're the one who taught me that the most important transformations start with someone deciding to pay attention to a child who needs to know they matter. The work continues. With love and infinite gratitude, Lily. Marcus placed the crane on his kitchen windowsill, where it joined dozens of others that had arrived over the years from students and teachers around the world. A global flock of paper birds carrying wishes for healing, connection, and hope. As the sun set over the city, casting the familiar patterns of light and shadow that had first caught his attention in the corridors of Meridian Tower, Marcus picked up a fresh sheet of paper and began to fold. Not because he needed to create another crane, but because the ancient rhythm of transformation had become as necessary to him as breathing. Fold. Press. Turn. Fold again. Each movement a meditation on possibility, each crease a reminder that ordinary things could become extraordinary when handled with care and attention. Outside his window, the city hummed with the quiet activity of evening. Parents helping children with homework, teachers preparing lessons for tomorrow, artists of all ages bent over their work tables, creating beauty from whatever materials they had at hand. And somewhere in the pediatric wing of UCSF Children's Hospital, Dr. Lily Hartwell was probably sitting beside a young patient's bed, teaching them to fold hope into paper wings, showing them that even in the darkest moments, human hands could still create light. The crane Marcus finished that evening was imperfect. One wing slightly larger than the other, the neck a little crooked, but it carried within its asymmetrical folds all the love and attention he had learned to give to ordinary moments. He placed it on the windowsill with the others, where it caught the last rays of sunlight and seemed, for just a moment, ready to take flight. Below in the street, a small girl walking with her grandmother stopped and pointed at something in the gutter, probably a discarded piece of paper that the wind had shaped into an interesting pattern. The grandmother paused, following her granddaughter's gaze, taking time to see what had captured the child's attention. They stood there for a long moment, two figures silhouetted against the evening light, sharing the kind of careful observation that transforms ordinary moments into memories worth preserving. Then the grandmother reached down, picked up the paper, and began to fold.
Marcus watched until they disappeared around the corner, carrying with them the quiet magic that happened whenever someone decided that beauty mattered more than efficiency, that attention was a form of love, that the most important work in the world was often the simplest work of all. He had learned, after all these years, that his grandmother had been right about the 1,000 cranes. The gods had granted him a miracle, not the dramatic single moment of transformation he had once imagined, but the ongoing miracle of lives touched, connections made, beauty created from the most ordinary materials. The work would continue long after he was gone, carried forward by hands he would never see in communities he would never visit, by teachers who would learn that paying attention to one child could change an entire world. And in hospital rooms and community centers, in corporate boardrooms and refugee camps, in kitchens and classrooms around the globe, people would continue to fold paper into birds, transforming flat surfaces into three-dimensional prayers, discovering again and again that the most profound magic was always the simplest. The power to create beauty with nothing more than care, attention, and the willingness to believe that small acts of love could reshape the world. The final scene unfolded 30 years later in a small classroom at the Lily Hartwell Community Arts Center, where an elderly Marcus, now in his 70s, but still moving with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime working with delicate materials, sat surrounded by a new generation of children whose families had just arrived in the United States. The faces around the table reflected the beautiful complexity of contemporary immigration. Somalia, Honduras, the Philippines, Afghanistan, each child carrying stories of journey and displacement, hope and uncertainty. They spoke different languages, practiced different religions, had fled different forms of hardship, but their hands moved with the same careful attention as they learned to transform flat paper into three-dimensional possibilities. "My teacher in my old country," said Amara, a 7-year-old from Eritrea. "She told me that when we move to new places, we have to leave many things behind. But she said the things we make with our hands, we can always carry with us." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what the child meant. "Your teacher was very wise. What we create becomes part of who we are, no matter where we go." In the corner of the room, a documentary crew was quietly filming the session, not for another award-winning feature, but for a simple educational video that would be shared with refugee resettlement organizations around the world. The director had insisted on minimal equipment and maximum respect for the participants' privacy, understanding that the goal was to document wisdom rather than create spectacle. "The secret," Marcus was saying to the children, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone who had taught this lesson thousands of times, "is to listen to the paper. Every sheet is different. Some are thick, some are thin, some have grain that goes one way, some another, but all of them can become beautiful if you pay attention to what they need." As he spoke, his hands moved through the familiar sequence of folds, muscle memory guiding movements that had become as natural as walking. But he wasn't just demonstrating technique. He was modeling a way of being in the world that these children would need as they navigated new schools, new languages, new ways of understanding home and belonging. "When I first came to this country," Marcus continued, "I was about your age, Amara. I didn't speak English very well, and I felt invisible most of the time. But my grandmother taught me that making beautiful things was a way of saying, I exist, I matter, I have something valuable to contribute, without needing any words at all. The children listened with the focused attention that Marcus had learned to recognize as hunger, not just for artistic technique, but for stories that helped them understand their own experiences of displacement and possibility. "What happened to your grandmother?" asked Miguel, an 8-year-old from Guatemala whose family had walked nearly 1,000 miles to reach the border. Marcus smiled, holding up the crane he had just completed. "She taught me everything she knew, and then she became part of everything I made. Every time I fold a crane, she's here with me. Every time I teach someone else, she's teaching too." As the workshop concluded and families began arriving to pick up their children, Marcus found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. From a lonely night janitor learning to connect with a grieving child, to an internationally recognized expert on community arts education, to an elderly teacher helping new immigrants understand that their traditions and creativity would be valued in their new home. The transformations had been both personal and systemic. The Lily Hartwell Community Arts Center now operated satellite programs in 43 cities, had influenced policy at the federal level regarding arts education funding, and had trained more than 10,000 community volunteers in techniques for using traditional crafts to build bridges across cultural differences. But the individual stories were what mattered most to Marcus. Children like Lily, who had grown from isolated and grieving to confident and healing-centered. Executives like Jonathan, who had learned to see their professional success as meaningful only when it contributed to community well-being. Families like his own, who had discovered that creativity could be a form of inheritance more valuable than financial wealth. As he prepared to leave the center that evening, Marcus paused in the lobby to study the permanent exhibition that had been installed to honor the program's history. Photographs covered the walls, images of workshops and celebrations, graduations and community events. Faces from around the world united by the shared experience of learning to transform ordinary materials into extraordinary expressions of hope. At the center of the display was a simple glass case containing a single origami crane, slightly lopsided, obviously made by beginner hands, but glowing under the museum lighting with unmistakable dignity. The placard beneath it read, "The first crane folded by Lily Hartwell, age 8, February 2024. Gift of the artist, who noted, 'This crane taught me that imperfect things can still carry perfect wishes.'" Marcus stood there for a long moment, remembering the night that had started everything. A grieving child, a patient teacher, a single moment of connection that had somehow grown into a global movement. He thought about his grandmother's hands guiding his young fingers through those first difficult folds, about the quiet confidence in her voice when she told him that art was a form of prayer, that beauty was a form of resistance, that paying attention was a form of love. The security guard approached with respectful familiarity. Maria, whose own children had been among the first students in Mrs. Chen's after-school program, who now served as the center's evening coordinator while finishing her degree in social work. "Ready to lock up, Mr. Chen?" she asked gently. Marcus nodded, taking one last look around the space that had become his life's work. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate that everyone possessed the capacity to create beauty if someone took the time to show them how. As he walked toward the exit, Marcus pulled out his phone and sent a text to Lily,
Now, Dr. Catherine Hartwell, director of pediatric art therapy at 3 hospitals and mother of 2 young children who were already showing signs of their mother's artistic sensitivity, taught 15 new students today. The crane you made when you were 8 is still inspiring people. Your mother would be so proud of the healer you've become. The response came quickly. And your grandmother would be proud of the teacher you became. See you Sunday for family origami time. The kids are excited to show you their latest dragons. Marcus smiled as he stepped out into the San Francisco evening, where the fog was beginning to roll in from the ocean, softening the edges of the city's familiar skyline. Somewhere in the distance, you could hear the sound of children playing in a nearby park, their laughter carrying on the wind like music. He thought about all the paper birds that had been folded since that first night 30 years ago. Millions of cranes carrying wishes for healing, hope, connection, and peace. Each one imperfect in its own way. Each one beautiful because it had been made by human hands with human intentions. Each one proof that the most ordinary materials could become extraordinary when touched by love and attention.
As Marcus walked the familiar streets toward home, he passed the small cafe where he and Jonathan had shared their first real conversation, now a popular gathering spot for parents whose children attended programs at the center. He passed Mrs. Chen's old apartment building, where a memorial garden had been planted in her honor, featuring plants from around the world that had been contributed by families she had helped welcome to the neighborhood. The city had changed in countless small ways over the 3 decades since that first origami lesson, becoming more generous, more inclusive, more willing to recognize that creativity was not a luxury, but a necessity for human flourishing. The changes weren't dramatic enough to make headlines, but they were visible to anyone who knew how to look. Community art installations in formerly neglected neighborhoods, school curricula that integrated traditional crafts with academic subjects, corporate policies that supported employee volunteering in creative education programs. At home, Marcus found a package waiting on his doorstep. No return address, but he recognized the careful handwriting immediately. Inside was a photograph of a young woman in medical scrubs standing beside a hospital bed where a child was showing off an origami butterfly. The woman's face was unfamiliar, but the joy in her expression was universal. The accompanying note was brief. Dear Mr. Chen, Dr. Hartwell taught me your origami techniques during my pediatric rotation. Last week, I used them to help a 5-year-old girl manage her anxiety before surgery. She made this butterfly and told me it was carrying a wish that all the scared kids in the hospital would find something beautiful to hold on to. I thought you should know that your grandmother's gift is still traveling to places you've never been, touching lives you'll never meet. With gratitude, Dr. Angela Martinez, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Marcus placed the photograph on his kitchen table next to dozens of others that had arrived over the years from students and teachers around the world. Each image told a similar story: human hands creating beauty from simple materials, human hearts finding connection across differences, human spirits discovering that they possess the power to transform not just paper, but entire communities. He made himself a cup of jasmine tea, the same kind Mrs. Chen had served him decades earlier, and sat down to read the evening news on his tablet. The headlines were familiar in their darkness: political conflicts, economic uncertainty, environmental challenges that seemed too vast for individual action to address. But Marcus had learned to read between the lines of despair, to look for the smaller stories that rarely made front pages, but that revealed the quiet persistence of human goodness. Tonight, he found an article about a refugee camp in Jordan where Syrian children were teaching origami to their younger siblings, using techniques they had learned from a volunteer who had trained at the Catherine Hartwell Community Arts Center. Another piece described a corporate team building program in Tokyo that used collaborative paper folding to help employees from different departments understand each other's perspectives. Each story was a reminder that the work he had begun with a single grieving child had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, becoming part of a global network of people who understood that paying attention to beauty was both a personal practice and a political act. As he prepared for bed, Marcus performed the ritual that had structured his evenings for 30 years. He folded a crane from whatever paper was available. Tonight, a page from a magazine featuring an article about climate change activism. The crane wasn't for anyone in particular. It was simply his way of ending each day with an act of creation rather than consumption, hope rather than despair. He placed the finished crane on his windowsill, where it joined the hundreds of others that formed a constantly changing installation in his small apartment. Some were gifts from students, others were his own work. All of them were reminders that transformation was always possible, that even the darkest news could become material for beauty if someone was willing to work with patience and love. Outside his window, the city settled into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere, a parent was probably helping a child with homework, reading a bedtime story, offering the kind of patient attention that Marcus had learned was the foundation of all other forms of care. Somewhere, a teacher was preparing lessons for tomorrow, thinking about how to reach the student who seemed unreachable, how to nurture the gift that every child carried, but that not every child knew how to express. As Marcus walked the familiar streets toward home, he passed the small cafe where he and Jonathan had shared their first real conversation, now a popular gathering spot for parents whose children attended programs at the center. He passed Mrs. Chen's old apartment building, where a memorial garden had been planted in her honor, featuring plants from around the world that had been contributed by families she had helped welcome to the neighborhood. The city had changed in countless small ways over the 3 decades since that first origami lesson, becoming more generous, more inclusive, more willing to recognize that creativity was not a luxury, but a necessity for human flourishing. The changes weren't dramatic enough to make headlines, but they were visible to anyone who knew how to look. Community art installations in formerly neglected neighborhoods, school curricula that integrated traditional crafts with academic subjects, corporate policies that supported employee volunteering and creative education programs. At home, Marcus found a package waiting on his doorstep. No return address, but he recognized the careful handwriting immediately. Inside was a photograph of a young woman in medical scrubs standing beside a hospital bed where a child was showing off an origami butterfly. The woman's face was unfamiliar, but the joy in her expression was universal. The accompanying note was brief. "Dear Mr. Chen, Dr. Hartwell taught me your origami techniques during my pediatric rotation. Last week, I used them to help a 5-year-old girl manage her anxiety before surgery. She made this butterfly and told me it was carrying a wish that all the scared kids in the hospital would find something beautiful to hold on to. I thought you should know that your grandmother's gift is still traveling to places you've never been, touching lives you'll never meet. With gratitude, Dr. Angela Martinez, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia." Marcus placed the photograph on his kitchen table next to dozens of others that had arrived over the years from students and teachers around the world. Each image told a similar story: human hands creating beauty from simple materials, human hearts finding connection across differences, human spirits discovering that they possess the power to transform not just paper, but entire communities. He made himself a cup of jasmine tea, the same kind Mrs. Chen had served him decades earlier, and sat down to read the evening news on his tablet. The headlines were familiar in their darkness: political conflicts, economic uncertainty, environmental challenges that seemed too vast for individual action to address. But Marcus had learned to read between the lines of despair, to look for the smaller stories that rarely made front pages, but that revealed the quiet persistence of human goodness.
Tonight, he found an article about a refugee camp in Jordan where Syrian children were teaching origami to their younger siblings, using techniques they had learned from a volunteer who had trained at the Lily Hartwell Community Arts Center. Another piece described a corporate team-building program in Tokyo that used collaborative paper folding to help employees from different departments understand each other's perspectives. Each story was a reminder that the work he had begun with a single grieving child had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, becoming part of a global network of people who understood that paying attention to beauty was both a personal practice and a political act. As he prepared for bed, Marcus performed the ritual that had structured his evenings for 30 years. He folded a crane from whatever paper was available. Tonight, a page from a magazine featuring an article about climate change activism. The crane wasn't for anyone in particular. It was simply his way of ending each day with an act of creation rather than consumption, hope rather than despair. He placed the finished crane on his windowsill, where it joined the hundreds of others that formed a constantly changing installation in his small apartment. Some were gifts from students, others were his own work. All of them were reminders that transformation was always possible, that even the darkest news could become material for beauty if someone was willing to work with patience and love. Outside his window, the city settled into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere, a parent was probably helping a child with homework, reading a bedtime story, offering the kind of patient attention that Marcus had learned was the foundation of all other forms of care. Somewhere, a teacher was preparing lessons for tomorrow, thinking about how to reach the student who seemed unreachable, how to nurture the gift that every child carried, but that not every child knew how to express.
And in hospitals and community centers, in refugee camps and corporate boardrooms, in classrooms and kitchen tables around the world, people were folding paper into birds, discovering again and again that their hands could create beauty, that their attention could heal wounds, that their willingness to see potential in the most ordinary materials could change everything. Marcus turned off the lights and settled in to sleep, carrying with him the deep satisfaction that came from a life spent in service to something larger than himself. He had learned, through decades of teaching and learning, that the most profound transformations were often the quietest ones. Not the dramatic gestures that made headlines, but the patient accumulation of small acts of love that eventually shifted the entire pattern of human possibility. In his dreams, he saw paper birds filling the sky above every city on Earth, their wings catching light from millions of windows where people sat at tables, patiently folding hope into three-dimensional form, teaching their children that beauty was always possible, that connection was always available, that the most important work in the world was often the simplest work of all, paying attention to what needed care and responding with the full generosity of human creativity. If this story of transformation and human connection has touched you, please consider liking and sharing it with others who might need this reminder that small acts of attention can change everything. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate the quiet heroes among us, still guiding his own after all these years, still whispering the ancient wisdom that had started everything. Every fold matters, little one. Every crane carries a wish, and the gods are always listening to the prayers we make with our hands. Marcus smiled in his sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate that love was not just an emotion, but a practice. That art was not just decoration, but transformation. That paying attention to one child's smile could somehow, mysteriously, beautifully, change the entire world.